I'm sure you know by now that Jesus did not speak fluent English. As a matter of fact, even though his mother was from Częstochowa, he didn't speak Polish neither. You see, the language that Jesus spoke every day of his life was Aramaic. It's a very obscure dialect of Hebrew that very few people speak nowadays. As a matter of fact, even back then, Aramaic was a language of a far removed province in the sticks of the Roman Empire. Very, very few people were able to speak Aramaic. So when the first disciples decided to put in writing the story of Jesus, they had a choice. We can either write down the original language of Jesus' everyday life, or we can choose another language that will be more popular, that more people will be able to read and understand. And they did make a good choice. Instead of writing in the language of Jesus, all the books of the New Testament Bible were written in Greek. Greek was the first century's version of English. Everybody who was somebody would know how to read and write Greek. All the knowledge, the sciences, mathematics, algebra, philosophy, they were all written in Greek. Names like Pythagoras, Socrates, Aristotle, right? You know them. They were all writing in Greek. And so a choice was very easy. We either use this obscure language, Aramaic, that nobody will ever be able to understand, or we write down the Gospels in the language of the learned, of the people who know something. Lucky for us, they chose Greek. But then, as Christianity slowly spread to the West, behind or beyond Greece and Syria and what today is Turkey, Christians arrived to Italy, to Rome, and further west. And you see, the further west you go, the fewer people spoke Greek. The people who were learned, educated, intelligentsia, would think of these people in the West as hillbillies, because they couldn't write Greek. They couldn't read Aristotle or Plato in its original text. But Christians have to face another challenge. We have these books, the Gospels, the letters of Paul, in Greek. But in the Western provinces, in Italy and France, nobody speaks Greek anymore. They all speak this vulgar language, Latin. As a matter of fact, the name of the first translation of Bible into Latin was called a vulgar translation. In Latin, vulgata, V-U-L-G-A-T-A, because the language was the language of the hillbillies. Because Latin was a very, very poor language. And so in the 3rd century, slowly Christianity in the West is switching from the very highly educated Greek to a vulgar language of the masses, Latin. By that time, we have already 3 languages, remember? Jesus speaks Aramaic. They write his works in Greek, and then they had to translate it to Latin, to the language of the hillbillies, to the language of the masses. From the 3rd century on, the Western Christianity spreads around all over Europe, and in Catholic churches they use that vulgar language of the masses. They use Latin. Eventually, with Middle Ages and later on, individual countries develop their own languages. So there is French, there is German, Latin morphs into Italian, and by the 20th century, there comes year 1962, the Second Vatican Council, and the Church once again has to face a new challenge. What do we do with our language? Do we keep praying and using the language that nobody understands any longer? Or do we translate it into the language of the masses? And in 1962, the Catholic bishops made another good choice to switch the language once again from Latin to national languages. And so each country now is using different language. You go to Poland, you will hear Polish. You go to Germany, you will hear German, and so on and so on. The history of Christianity is a history of changing our languages. At the very beginning, the disciples made a choice to change the obscure language of Aramaic to Greek, then Greek to Latin, and then Latin to our national languages. What was the criteria of the change? To spread the nets as wide as possible, to catch as many fish, so to speak, as you can. Not to limit the message to the very few who speak the obscure language, but to cast the nets as wide as possible. Of course, change was never easy, and every time the church changed the language, there are people who said, "But we have always said it that way." Change can be challenging. Change can be upsetting, especially if you have invested enough in the ways of the past. Today's first reading is from the book of Jonah, and the passage is very short, but you know the book of Jonah. It's a very picturesque fairy tale. Jonah lived a long and happy life, but at one point, God supposedly tells him, "Listen, Jonah, you will become my voice. You will go to a great city of Nineveh. In that city, they are so corrupted, they are so wicked, that you have to go to the streets of the city for 3 days and tell them, I, God, will destroy your city. God will punish you for your wicked ways." Basically, Jonah was called to be the prophet of fire and brimstone. Now, he didn't like the idea. So his first reaction was, "Thank you, God, but over my dead body." So he escapes. He goes on a cruise instead of going to Nineveh. He gets on a ship, is looking forward to his Caribbean islands, but then, out of the blue, there is a storm, and the sailors decide that it must be Jonah's fault that the storm is so severe. So they throw him outside the boat, and conveniently there is a big whale waiting with his open mouth for Jonah to be fed. So for the next 3 days, Jonah becomes plankton. He lives and is slowly being digested in the stomach of the whale, because a whale is a mammal, as you know. And after 3 days, I guess Jonah was a strong man, didn't get digested. that whale spits him on the beach, again very conveniently, not far away from Nineveh. Having learned his lesson, Jonah says, okay, I got the message. You want me to go and preach brimstone and fire to Nineveh. Okay, I will do it. So today's passage finds him going to the city of Nineveh, to this very wicked, corrupted city. Maybe it's like New York City in the Fleet Week. And Jonah says, God will destroy your city. God will punish you. Brimstone and fire upon your heads. He was supposed to do that for 3 days. But after 1 day, today's reading tells us, God changed his mind. Did you catch that passage? After 1 day of Jonah preaching brimstone and fire, God says, maybe not. Maybe I will not destroy the city of Nineveh. And Jonah, understandably so, says, what? After all that I suffered, after all that I invested in that job that you gave me, now you are changing your mind? And he is really upset. If I wasn't in church, I would have said that he's peep off at God. So he goes into the desert. He says, I'm done with you, God. I want to die. You disappointed me. I don't want to have anything to do with you ever again. Eventually, God helps Jonah to change his mind. But notice that Jonah is not disappointed or upset about anything else, but about the fact that change took place. Because, again, he invested so much of his time, of his life, into that project of brimstone and fire, that when God changes God's mind, Jonah is not happy. Change will always cause some of us to be unhappy. Change will always cause some of us to be uncomfortable. And it's happening again in the church as we speak, with Pope Francis pushing different items of his agenda of change. Many priests, bishops, Catholics are becoming very uncomfortable. Even our beloved retired Archbishop of St. Louis is very outspoken critique of this change mission of Pope Francis. He and many other bishops say, how come the Pope allows divorced and remarried people to come to communion? This is a change of ancient teaching of the Church. We cannot change that rule. Now, in Brazil, in the Catholic Church, they are talking about ordaining married men to priesthood because they have so many parishes without priests. And the Pope supposedly is giving them a green light to do that. So very soon in Brazil, in the Roman Catholic Church, you will have Roman Catholic priests with wives and children. And of course, there are many of the bishops and priests who say, over my dead body, we cannot change that part of our teaching. In our society, things change as well. Our understanding and definition of marriage is changing. We are not buying wives for 2 cows and 5 sheep anymore. We are not entering into the contract of marriage as we have for the last 2,000 years. As a matter of fact, marriage was not a sacrament all the way until the 12th century. Changes have happened and will continue to happen. And as we discern how to deal with them, there is one criteria that makes it good or bad. The criteria comes from the gospel in today's passage. Is the change helping us to be the fishers of men and women? Is the change allowing us to throw the nets wider than before? Is the change helping us to bring more people into the nets of the church? If it is, it's a good change. If it isn't, it's a bad one. The criteria is very simple. Be the fishers of men. Spread your nets as wide as possible. If your change is helping to bring more fish into the boat of the church, it's a good change. Now think about changes in your personal life. Maybe when your youngest child finally went away to college, and you and your wife or your husband are left just by yourselves. Your house that was so full of life is quiet. And you don't know if you will kill your wife or husband or not, but your life has changed. And you have to find new ways of working out in this new environment. How is your relationship making it better or worse? Perhaps you are a widow or widower or divorced person and have found yourself single again. And again you find new ways of living your life in a changed environment. Perhaps you had to find different faith, a different church, because your old church was not to your liking, because your old church was doing something wrong. So you find yourself out of the blue going to a Catholic church after years of being of different denomination. And you ask yourself, do I really belong with all this kneeling and standing and sitting and kneeling and standing again? There are many kinds of changes that have happened and will continue to happen in the life of the church, in your personal life. And the question you and I have always asked ourselves, is that change allowing us to be better fishers of men and women? If the change is helping us to spread the nets wider, it is a good change. And we, as we continue the journey here at St. Stanislaus, I have to warn you, there might be some changes in the future. Maybe one day we'll have to use different language when our children speak no English anymore. Maybe one day we'll have a woman priest pastor when I'm happily retired. Maybe one day there'll be other things happening here at St. Stanislaus. And when you face those new challenges, those new changes, remember to ask yourself, is this helping me to be better fishers of men and women? Amen.